We know you already know your attorney. You don't have to.
I think we're ready.
You don't have to dress like one.
All right, let me make my pleasantries. Welcome to the May 25th, 2011 special called work session. A work session is a more informal setting to update the council on business items. No votes will be taken on these items. Tonight there's one agenda item. Public comment is allowed that is germane to an agenda item. If you wish to speak, you are required to fill out a public comment card and turn it into the city clerk's staff. That may be Alan.
Alan?
Alan?
Hey, how are y'all doing tonight?
Good. You're right in the middle of my little speech, so I'll continue on.
Oh, okay.
Public comment will be allowed for a total of 10 minutes per agenda item and no more than 2 minutes per person. Public comment will be heard at the beginning of each item. Once the item is called, no other public cards will be accepted. Mr. City Clerk, do we have any public comment cards? And we've got, just for the record, we've got Alan Tort on the phone. And Alan, is everything all right there? I heard there's some tornadoes.
Yes, sir. We were dodging them for a while, but we hung out half the day in the halls in the mall, but we're good now.
All right, good deal. Okay, public comment.
We got one from Mr. Adam Orton.
Okay.
We got two.
Is Adam speaking? Or Buck?
I'll just fill one out and say, if there's an opportunity to speak later on, I have nothing to say other than
Okay.
happy Wednesday.
Okay, do we have any other comment? I guess Buck, you'd like to speak?
I'm going to say a little bit more now.
Okay.
I'd like to kind of speak just a little bit about Crabapple. When we all became a city, I presented a kind of historical view of Crabapple to the city council then, and kind of explained how it had kind of run off the tracks a little bit and how we need to pull it back on the road. And for the last 6 years, I guess, you know, we've kind of been watching it stay off the road. Between that and the economy keeping it off the road, kind of got a chance and opportunity now to get things back on track. And I always use the analogy when I talk about this to a lot of people, being a Crabapple person, we get a lot of questions about it. And I always say, you know, if I'm on my way to L.A. and I find myself in Paducah, then I don't stay in Paducah. I reset my course and I head to California. I go back to L.A. where I was going to. So I think that at this point in Crabapple, we're definitely in Paducah. And I think that it's going to take a certain amount of substance and creative thinking and vision and rule breaking and groundbreaking to get us where we need to go to this next step. And the thing that I like to kind of give you all the power to do is to be bold and to think out of the box a little bit and to try not to take all the things that we've been resting on and holding on to for the last 4 or 5 years as far as things that we think are true and right and binding and enforceable and unresisting and unrelenting, and go ahead and break through and do what's right for Crabapple. So, you know, I just like to kind of say I'm looking for change and I'm looking for action, I'm looking for things to happen. So I hope this time we move in that direction definitively and formally, and don't just kind of push it around a little bit and stay up at the 5,000-foot view. Thank you.
Thank you, Buck. Do you have any more public comment? Okay. The city clerk will sound the first and only agenda item.
Discussion of the Crabapple Plan as presented by Lou Oliver, Inc. Old Town Solutions, to identify current policy changes needed for implementation and to discuss the long-term planning needs of the Crabapple Crossroads community and the city of Milton's future city center. Mr. Lou Oliver.
Well, I'm happy to be back. A month is a long time. A lot's happened since then. Since our public presentation, I took the liberty of showing your plan to Roswell DOT. I think it made them a bit upset, and their perception is that they're slightly behind Milton now, which is why I showed it to them. And I have a large developer in South Fulton County ready to do a plan since this presentation, 700-acre site, and they're committed to doing the whole thing with the Screen Street system. So this thing's got legs, and I think it's really going to be phenomenal to see this happen. Well, I took the liberty of doing a little outline of what I think needs to happen. And I can run through it. People can, actually, I think I'll run through it and pause at each of the subcategories and let people make comment. Does that sound good? Well, first, I think the most important thing to happen is mayor and council need to adopt the town plan in concept. And that doesn't mean you agree with every street tree or every road alignment or even with the use of every particular parcel.
Can I break in 1 second?
Yes.
Lou, do we have other copies? Can we get copies for anybody else who would like?
I've got one more.
Maybe Susie, if you wouldn't mind, or somebody, if we can get some copies, Chris. So you guys can follow along. Sorry.
Because I think until you adopt the concept, we can't really move forward in any definitive kind of way. And that's the single biggest thing. It's also the area that I don't really have much to comment on.
I did have one comment on this, and I guess it goes back to exactly what this is. Because this, I actually listened to the Planning Commission's meeting the other night, and they had a lot of discussion. Is this a master plan? Because it's not what they thought of as a master plan. Because it's more of a, what exactly do we want to call this? Because it's not really a town plan. It is more of a visioning. What do we call this when we adopt it?
You could call it the conceptual town plan, because it's at conceptual stage.
And I might want not to put you on the spot, Lynn, but if you've got any comments too on guidance on that, what your thoughts are.
Oh, okay.
What step are we taking? Is this like Karen said, is it a master plan? Is it a town plan? Is it an idea? Is it?
Well, traditionally, you all have seen master plans almost more in light of zoning plans and future land use plans. And this is not really that.
No.
So maybe that's where some of this confusion is, because what you're seeing now is more of a very concept, high level, artistic rendering of the town. There are some uses included. There are some new streets included, but it's not what we would traditionally see as a comprehensive plan or a zoning master plan.
So we can call it like the concept plan for Crabapple?
Yes, ma'am.
Crabapple concept plan.
Yes, Julie.
And one, just thank you, everybody. I think it's always good to get together. To your point, it's a long time. I think that the last time we were all together talking about this, that one of the takeaways, and Chris, you can, maybe he's not here, is that one of the things that had been talked about as a next step, and maybe that kind of blends with tonight's meeting, is that there was going to be some kind of evaluation of kind of the concept plan, to use that term currently. But within that concept plan, and to your point, Lynn, within the concept, what uses were being proposed, how did those uses compare and contrast with what's currently there? How did the proposed, some of the visuals, what do those mean in terms of real densities? I know that, Lou, one of the things that you had brought up was that part of it would depend on whether or not there would be senior living in some of those, I'll call them pods, or not, and whether or not senior living would be, calculated a certain way. But I think that even as we approach it conceptually, I think that some of that effort and work is still important even at this stage, so that we can understand what is that visual. I mean, it's one thing to look, as we all know, it's one thing to look at a rendering, if you will. It's another to understand what is that rendering if it were on the ground.
What are the statistics involving
What is the data that would support that visual? Not good, bad, or indifferent, just so that we understand what are we really looking at visually. And so to me, there would be some layers as part of that concept plan that we just don't yet have, that I think Chris had indicated that maybe staff in working with Lou would perhaps have before we have this come back to us as a concept plan.
And there are some new planning models that don't rely as heavily on the layers that you're talking about as they used to. And I think that's part of what Lou will talk about a little bit today as he lays out kind of the implementation strategy. You know, what things are we looking for? If we use this new planning model, it's called form-based coding. If we use that, it's very general with regard to overall uses, but it is very specific with regard to the buildings themselves, their aesthetic, their massing, where they are located on the site and on the street. And I don't want to steal Lou's thunder, so I'm going to turn that back over to him. And I think you might find that, Councilwoman Bailey, I think you'll find that in some of his presentation, and we'll continue to answer more questions as we go.
And I know that you had mentioned that at our last meeting, that you could take that, and I think even if we start to look at a form-based sort of modeling approach, I still think that component that we talked about at our last meeting is important. It's just understanding what's kind of the data behind that visual. And so I still see that as something that would come out of tonight's meeting, but also had originally come out of that first presentation, Lou, that you gave us. So I just want to make sure that tonight that we're not bypassing that step. I don't think we are. It just seems that that's still kind of a necessary step.
I think there are two categories that should happen after the adoption. One is to create an architectural code. If you jump down to C, it would be to begin inputting the town plan into CAD and calibrating what we've done based on mayor and council and staff's current ideology. And I'll go into that in a minute. Under architectural code, you would have a category called site planning. And Julie, I think some of this will speak to what you're talking about. The site planning would contain building setbacks as well as building build-to lines. And build-to lines are sort of the reverse of building setbacks. You're required to put a building, in other words, in a downtown, you require a zero setback, for instance. So there'll be cases where you want buildings in perfect alignment to define a space or a square or a street. Under that is just encroachments, porches, balconies, chimneys. If you look at the slide of Canton Street, the porch is an encroachment into the right-of-way. And so whether it's a psychological encroachment or real encroachment into a right-of-way, we can discuss that. It doesn't make any difference. You can code it either way. But and you can even require encroachments if you want arcaded sidewalks like Dahlonega and Roswell. You would show parking zones in the site plan. And these are very general. I mean, there are layers of details associated with each of these. You can show coverage ratios for every site. If you want a maximum building coverage ratio, we can dictate that. And there should be some. And it's actually impossible to do these without it. Tree save areas can be incorporated into the site plan. You can actually get a good tree survey, and those can be put on the site plan in CAD. Service yards for mechanical equipment, dumpsters, etc. Hardscape landscape requirements. Any kind of eco features you want to incorporate in, like bioswales or one of them. Solar cells over parking areas. There's all kinds of things you can do there.
I guess this is all predicated, this first section is all predicated on that we adopt the transportation layout as you've shown it.
Well, no, it actually isn't. The code and the code is a free-floating part. In other words, if you tell me you like neighborhoods that look like Madison, Georgia, and you like downtowns that look like Dahlonega, you can design a code that is not even specific to this site. In other words, conceivably, you could use it on one of your new Arnoldville nodes. So it's independent of the plan.
Well, still in all, you're transportation layout is going to affect where your parking zones are, where your service yards are.
They totally work together. Yes, they do. But when you're doing, in other words, site planning. I wish I brought the code I was working on today, but because it's actually the Vickery code. Vickery doesn't even have a code. However, now since there are a lot of people involved, we're having to go back and generate a code, and you have multitudes of different site plans to address particular conditions. I.e., if you have a level piece of property and you're in a downtown zone, you're going to want to set the building at the sidewalk and require parking in the rear. If you're in an area where there's a huge tree save area in the rear and you go, oops, that doesn't work, we need another site plan that addresses that. So you'll end up with best, good, and okay site plan conditions. And sometimes you have to do you actually have to do a lot of okays and not best when you're implementing these things. So yes, it will work with the master plan, but they can be done independently. Yes, the process can be independent. I think I went over that. Yes, hardscape landscape requirements, which is pavement materials, techniques, and of course all your landscape requirements. The eco features, again, we can describe bioswales, we can describe solar charging stations for electric vehicles in the future, gravel lots. I mean, just the sky's the limit there. The next section under the architectural code would be describing the actual buildings. And I think this along with the site planning's very, very critical. I think if you look at the history of Milton, it's probably the piece that's been missing for many years before you were incorporated, and a lot of damage has been done now. But it's not too late. And you really describe buildings as the mass, and that's the building volumetrics. This includes heights. It includes height limits. It includes square footage limits. And it can actually be the reverse of that too. You may want to require a 2-story building in a certain spot, and you may want to require a certain square footage. There are places where that's actually desirable, where you're trying to create retail presence, for instance. If you're in the heart of the downtown, you may actually want to complete a square, and you really don't want a 1-story house on one side. You want a 2-story building. So there can also be requirements. Fenestrations, which is doors and windows, where do they occur? What sides of the buildings do they occur on? Additive features, which we talked about, that's also covered in site planning, mostly in the form of porches, balconies, and bay windows. You can, if you're designing a town square, you can require arcades. That's one thing you can require out of the developer if you want a covered pedestrian atmosphere. And then the category that people usually think of as this whole architectural control issue, which is the architectural skin, what you see from the outside. It's based on the local vernacular, which just simply means a local building tradition. If you look at the best buildings in Crabapple, they're usually based on that. There's some that are not. The syntaxes, meaning the applied style to a building. You can have a local vernacular form, and you can have Victorian ornament all over it. So it's an applied style, and you go over what kind of applied styles that you think are acceptable here. In Serenbe, there is we wrote that code to have vernacular forms, but the sky's the limit on the icing on the building. You can do everything from very traditional to through any historic style all the way to modern. So you can have all of that. I think at Crabapple you're going to probably want to restrict it to the lower end of the spectrum, but there's room for some innovation, perhaps. And I would do, for Crabapple, I would definitely pre-select materials. We call this preemptive design because we know what happens when you don't do that. You get the worst of the worst, not the best of the best. And it's because of our culture that we can import anything from around the world, and therefore we don't have any sieve anymore, any aesthetic sieve. In the past, you couldn't import anything unless you were very wealthy, so it naturally limited the palette of the materials. So I think we would want to pre-select materials. This is what Roswell does not do, and they should very desperately do it at this point because they're losing it, especially in the historic district. That covers really the architectural code. I have one here that we wrote for Hammond's Ferry, I guess probably 8 years ago, but it has some similarities to Crabapple. If anybody wants to look at this, I'll be glad to pass it around. And these various these site plans, let me start over. You can do your code to be specific to a user. In other words, we design and we write the whole code, but for instance, if Chris had a user come in who wanted to do a gas station and general store, for instance, he could select the category that just applied to that and print it out, or email just that slot to the developer who would not read the entire code. It's a total waste of paper, and you totally lose people. They don't have the patience for it. So you can tailor this to individual needs very easily. Any ideas or suggestions, comments on architectural codes? And there are many ways to do them.
I agree that we need an architectural code, probably not just for Crabapple, but for other evolving areas as well.
And it can be a template for the future, for future nodes too, definitely. The next category that I think would need to happen is you would just input this new town plan into the computer, and we would probably have another little round of stakeholder meetings. It probably wouldn't be 2 weeks, but it might need to be a day or two. And now that people have had a month to really digest this whole thing, we could make final revisions, coordinate this with traffic engineering and GDOT, which I think is very important at this point. Develop and refine the street sections, the street alignments, the intersection details. And the good thing is we've already got to start on this because the plan is in the computer, including the proper street widths. So we've got a jump start on this. I'm sure Carter can see a lot of room for improvement in some things. On another layer, you show existing lot lines, and then you can show proposed lot lines for various usages. You on the plan, and you would have the ability to print this out at a much larger scale. In other words, if Chris had this general store developer and he wanted to show him the site plan, he could print the plan to scale that would show all the building setbacks on it. So it would not only be on the master plan, but it would be on each site plan. And it's much easier to coordinate this whole thing that way. Proposed lot lines when they are on an individual piece of property, of course, are subject to change, and we can work with that property owner, but I think they're always subject to change. If you've got 30 acres and it's residential, you may not like a 50 by 100 foot lot in 5 years that you may like right now. So it may shrink, or it may get bigger depending on market conditions. You show the building setbacks and the build-to lines on every piece of property. You can show, and you should show existing building footprints. You should show tree save areas. There are going to be some areas that there are no trees. There are other areas that are going to have specimen trees and, in fact, whole groves, and those need to be shown and dealt with. And then you can show new building footprints based on current successful models. That's very easy to do in housing nowadays. It's probably a little bit harder to do in commercial because, and Adam, I'm sure, could speak more to that of what the trends are right now. But that's something we would need some definite input into. Show all the easements. This one, this is probably something Lynn could speak to better than me, but you would overlay the zoning classifications and the special districts onto the lots, and this can be a form-based code, which I think is very economically agile, and I think when you look at creating and implementing crabapple, probably the hardest part of this is going to be to get the mixed-use developer really engaged and committed. I think when you can, to Julie's point, when you can identify the uses of a building, the allowable uses, and I don't think it should be one, I think it should be a cone of uses, you can allow these different occupants of essentially a building shell. And this is really how traditional towns are. They exist like this, and they thrive like this. They're very able to change with the town, with the times. You look at Broughton Street in Savannah, what may have been offices 40 years ago are now retail condominiums, and vice versa. You're going to see different uses coming in and out. Here locally, if you look at Sloan Street in Roswell, which was called Slum Street 20 years ago, and it was a slum street, it was saved by commercial uses coming in because it was cheap real estate, and they had to renovate up to Historic Preservation Commission standards and landscape. That's been done. It's very successful. The trend now is back into residential. These businesses are turning back into residential because it's such a cool place to be. So I think the uses, you may not want massage parlors and auto mechanics, but there are a lot of very compatible uses for this district. I think the last one is to me, it's very important. I think different municipalities see this differently. I should take comments on this part I just went over on Part C. This dealing with this town plan and really getting it into CAD and creating a technical document out of it.
Lou, I have a question. This is Alan.
Hey, Alan.
Hey, how many, I know you said that we would provide some options for uses for the property. I'm wondering, though, how many options that you can provide, or better yet, how much can you limit the options that you provide, given that these are parcels that may, just be right now intended for residential, or even if we changed it to commercial. How can you specifically limit it to certain things that you want in terms of the town planning?
Well,
without taking away uses to make it, what a property owner would think would be not the best use of the property, so to speak.
Well, I do think there should be areas that are just residential, period. That the whole thing should not be free usage. I think there would be special districts that the uses could flex up or down in intensity. And I think that market conditions have to dictate what happens in those special districts. And we're not talking about this whole thing. We're talking about limited areas of it. Does that answer your question?
Well, I guess I'm thinking of if we have a vision for what we want town center to look like and where we want certain businesses to be positioned,
Yes.
in relation to City Hall and that kind of thing.
Yes.
How do you put specific uses on properties such that they're so narrow to get exactly what it is that you want to do? Because right now, the restrictions we put on uses of property still allows for a litany of things that they could possibly a developer could put there or
Yes.
a business owner could have.
I think that if you look at successful downtowns, they almost always have a business owners guild or some such group. And that, to me, that's a big question mark. Your question, and it's a very hard one. If we were doing a new town from scratch, which we are still doing, believe it or not, nowadays, we would have a retail marketing entity come in and program the retailing. Here is where this anchor goes, here's where the YMCA goes, here's where the library goes, here is your neighborhood pharmacy, here's the bank, and you form a synergy with all of these different users to create a successful downtown. It's the same thing they do in a shopping mall, except you're applying it to a downtown. I think if your business community can accept that and submit to it, it'll make a much more successful downtown. I think if they don't, it's a little bit harder. Roswell has never done retail programming, and they should, and they've been told this many times, because there's a lot of inconsistent hours, there's inconsistent quality. They're not neighborhood services there. All that's there is boutiques and restaurants, which there's something to be said for boutiques and restaurants, but you can't have a real neighborhood center just with that. And I think that it would take a professional coming in and programming this, which can be done. The city could sponsor it and attempt to corral the community together to implement it, but that's not my exact area of expertise. I sort of told you everything I know.
I've got a kind of follow up to that. Go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, so if we were to have some programming done, is it legal to say, okay, for this certain land lot, these are the three uses for this land lot?
That I can't tell you.
Okay. Because that to me would be what you would need to have if you really wanted to see a vision through. But I don't know that that's legal, given that you're basically telling the landowner how they're going to use their business, and you haven't, there might be, in the zoning, there might be 30 things that they could possibly do with that property, and now you've limited them to 3 in order to see your vision through.
Unless, yeah, I'm sorry.
And I think what we've got to do is we've got to come up with a vision that's good enough that we can sell to those property owners that say, okay, we are on board with you. We understand that these 3 or 10 or 6 or whatever uses are going to be what make this whole thing go. So it's a kind of a
It's a partnership.
we've got to do a good enough job of coming up with a vision and selling it to the property owners that they want to be on board with it and are going to work with us.
But how do
And
you
I
balance?
think also you handle it too architecturally, you know.
Yeah.
These are the guidelines, the way we want it to look, but, you know, we're not going to tell you exactly what business you have to have in there, but when you have these guidelines and this is the way it looks and feels and works, that will attract the types of businesses you want.
It does attract, definitely.
Well, my question was going to be, how do you balance all this with the economics of actually making it a place where people do want to come in, do want to build, and once they do, the people around can sustain the businesses. Because that's you look around here and you got more vacant buildings than you can imagine. You don't want to come in and have a building, then that whatever business you decided you wanted to go there not really work economically, and so they've left town and you end up with an empty building. So I think, how do you balance it with the economics of actually getting the right businesses in that will not only want to come in but be able to sustain themselves once they're there?
I think the retail consultant would help a lot with that, can answer a lot of those questions. And good common sense and experience. I don't think you want to overbuild this from a retail standpoint. It would be suicide. But certainly there are areas to add, definitely. And Adam, I'm sure you have a huge amount of insight on the whole issue. If you're allowed to
Mayor,
talk.
I would love to get some input from some of the other people here.
Well, are we, in fact, if we want to go through your agenda, and then I'd like to kind of open up the
Sure.
discussion. And,
Sure.
let's, because I've got some questions.
And then the last recommendation, I really think you need to hire, it's called a town urbanist, some people call it a town architect, and they would administer this implementation. The position could be on a contract basis or they could be an employee. It's a very hands-on position. They coordinate with the city, with mayor and council, with builders, developers, and they have the authority to implement the plan and with the architectural code. You can have a DRB, the DRB or another DRB oversee the process, and they can either micromanage it or they can kind of stand back until they see mistakes being made, and then they can say, wait a minute, we see this differently. So there are different levels of control you can have over this. If you have a particularly really good town urbanist, you can stand back a little bit. If you have somebody who's not really proven, you would have to have greater oversight, I think. This position could serve also future development and redevelopment areas in Milton. This one person could deal with all of that. And if you consider this person, you should base the decision on their successful built projects. They have to have a design eye. They have to be incredibly diplomatic, and they have to have a working knowledge of development, implementation, construction. Very, very broad kind of person, and they do exist. There are not many of them, but they do exist, and some of them need work nowadays. That is what I think it would take to implement this.
Can we start, really going back to the first item, what do we call this? And I know we kind of talked about, Karen mentioned or asked the question, but is a crabapple concept plan. And what I'm not real clear on, and I think, yeah, the plan looks great, but, and we talked about implementation and the council adopting the concept and all that. Well, what does that actually mean? Does that mean that you take this plan right here and it's written in stone, and we're adopting it? Or, is this just a concept we're adopting and then it's going to be changing and moving and
It will
it'd
change.
be neat if this could happen all at once, but it's not. It's going to be, as you said, generations before it's totally done.
Yeah. I think it does change and move, and I think it has to.
Are there any limitations with this
Well,
plan that
you can put limitations on it. We can talk about the limitations. The fundamental street pattern should be a limitation. There can be a few exceptions to it. There's some areas that are not as critical as others, but I think the street plan and the with respects to car arterials is fairly. I think it's very direct and very clean cut, unless engineering comes back and says this is impossible because of XYZ reasons. So I think transportation for cars is very empirical. It's not really a question mark. I think the second layer is interconnectivity for pedestrians. The concept of interconnectivity for pedestrians. The third is probably the bicycle interconnectivity. The fourth is probably the golf cart interconnectivity, i.e. green streets and trail systems. And those last ones, aside from cars, are all kind of movable. If you say, for instance, it's probably going to take me forever to find the picture. If you say, and this is is there a laser on this thing? There is. If you say we have to get, we want this neighborhood and this neighborhood to be served by golf carts, and there must be a connection here, and there must be a future tie-in to some neighborhood in Alpharetta, let's say. That can be a principle. And whoever owns all of this property, whether it's 10 owners or one, they can work with A, staff, B, if you hire this town urbanist, they can work with staff and this person on the exact layout and come back to mayor and council for approval of the final plat. And I do think you need that kind of flexibility in much of this plan.
And part of my concern, and also concern of possibly some of the council members or people I've talked to and all, it's tough when you look at something and you're trying. A lot of times if you've got a plan that you feel like you got to pull the trigger. Okay, are we adopting this? Is it set in stone? You don't want to make that decision because is it right? Is it 100% right, wrong, or whatever? And I think to Bert's point, I think we want to have a plan or a crab-apple area to where not only property owners and future property owners and businesses feel fortunate and lucky to be there. We should also feel lucky that we've got people that want to work with us and do something really good and all. So, I think that's kind of where I'm seeing a lot of, are we adopting this? Is this set in stone, or, are these some guidelines? Do we have some flexibility here in that direction?
Yeah, I mean, I think you do. I think you have flexibility. I think you all are going to have to tell me what you want, or staff what you want. And if you think, in other words, if you think it's too extreme, we can peel back a layer or two.
But I guess my question is, at what point do we need to do that? Do we need to go ahead and do that now before we even adopt the town plan concept? Or do
I
we
think
keep it?
I think you do need to look at it now.
Okay.
Yeah.
So-
Yeah, my question would be, I mean, it's one thing to adopt a concept, and I would say that that's akin to saying, yeah, we're all on board trying to do what we can to somehow make this become a reality at some point in time. Now, that's a far cry from being committed and actually doing what needs to be done to make it happen. But I can't imagine adopting anything other than a conceptual plan for continued research unless we knew exactly what this meant to the city in terms of, I don't know, about 15 different layers of costs. I mean, we've got direct costs that we're going to have to invest in this particular area to make the infrastructure that needs to be there to make all this stuff happen. And, I mean, I can't even stop thinking about how many different layers of those types of things we got to worry about. So I mean, there's a lot of work. I mean, I would say that this is akin to, the computer business when you have your architect come in and say, hey, I'm going to build you this great data center. Sure. And then when you look at what it's going to cost to do that, you say, well, maybe we don't need that, double backup system.
I think if you look at, to make it simple, if you look at one idea is the city does the streets. I mean, they commit to putting in the streets in whatever fashion. Let's say you want to put in 2 out of 3 or whatever. That's one issue. I think a lot of the other infrastructure issues, like if you look at the pedestrian streets, the green streets, the developer can put those in.
Right.
They're very light kind of infrastructure. They're no heavier than an alley.
Right.
So alleys and pedestrian streets, the developer has to put those in, for instance, because you're not going to want to put in alleys.
Right.
It's too much.
And I guess my point is that, this goes back to what we've already all said, is we have to have a lot of buy-in. I mean, the developers,
Sure.
I mean, when you look at these pictures, I mean, who would want to be against having something that looks this beautiful? It's hard to imagine. Now, when you start getting down to the cost for it and who's going to pay for it, I don't mind heaping, this on, the developers to do, but they might have a couple of ideas about how they want to share those costs as well. So again, that's a huge set of discussions that we have to have. How can we go about adopting something unless we had answers to those questions?
Or if we have options and flexibility, because it'd be one thing if we had an owner that owned all this property and was on board working with the city and having a firm concept, we're going to go forward, like CRV or something like that.
Right.
But, we've just got pieces
It's a
of
bunch
owners
of people.
everywhere.
Yes.
And everybody's not going to want, so, we got to have some options for
Well-
all of them so they can buy in.
Well, that goes to my question further on y'all's 2 points here. I understand this. We've got to have a basis for everything we do going forward. But I know you've been involved in Vickery and Serenby and a couple others where you've dealt with open, clean canvas, dealing with one developer, one landowner, essentially.
Some more complicated than others, yeah.
I'm sure.
Yeah.
Yes. And can you speak to any project that you've worked on that might be similar to this, where you have multiple property owners, you have partial infrastructure in place, how you pull it all off, I guess, how you get buy-in from the development community, how you pay for infrastructure, and how do you make it a destination?
Well, the implementation in a retrofit, I'm probably least experienced with, except in Roswell, which I've been involved in that place for many, many years. Roswell is almost all developer-led as far as infrastructure improvement and vertical construction. if you do a redevelopment in Roswell, you have to put in brick sidewalks, you have to do the street lights, street trees, and so if somebody buys a 5-acre parcel here, they're going to have to make all the improvements to the property outside of the road itself. In other words, from the curb into the street is city controlled, and from the curb back, the developer has to bring the property up to standard. And that's how most of the historic district has been reconstructed, with the exception of Canton Street, which was the brick sidewalks there were a civic project. It is, of course, it's slower going. It's a little bit slower.
It's not going to happen in my lifetime. More than
I don't
hope it
know.
does.
You're really
Can't say.
in a short time.
What do you think about truck tomorrow?
And
No,
You're-
particularly with the economy that you're looking at now, I think it's going to bounce back eventually, but not with the strength that we've seen it in the past 10, 15 years.
yeah, I think the conviction of the plan and the plans you put forward and the vision you put forward will actually draw the people to do this. And I'm always an optimist, fatally so. But some of the people in Roswell that I've shown this to, that are like on my task force, are threatening to move to Crabapple. And I've told them, do it and
Will
die.
they put the streets in for us?
As residents, they want to be here.
That's what the mayor told me.
Um,
That's right.
And I hear this quite a bit. If Crabapple's doing this, this is what Roswell should have done, and they're disgusted with Roswell. You're going to create an amazing draw, but you have to have the right master plan, and you really have to have the architectural document, and you have to enforce it. And there's no question you're going to create a destination. To me, there's absolutely no question. And I've seen a lot of successes and failures. We do towns internationally. We've seen them all.
Just kind of taking off from that point about the concept plan and to Joe Longoria's point, it seems that there's a couple of things that can kind of continue to occur as we start to answer some of these other questions. As an example, I think my guess would be that everybody would agree that architectural code is important. And my guess would be if we went around the room, most people in the room, including business owners, developers, et cetera, would agree that architectural code makes a big difference. And if you're ever going to have any vision, whatever you define that as, regardless of how big or how small it is that would be a critical component. It seems, and to the mayor's question, what is it when we would say that we would buy into a concept? And this kind of goes back to the first question I posed to Lynn, that I think that goes back to our first meeting, or our meeting 30 days ago, was that in order to really understand what the concept is, I do still believe that there's some data that we need just so that we can articulate what it actually means to citizens, to businesses, to developers, so that when we look at that pod that has senior living proposed, what does that mean? What is that density?
You abstract the pretty plan.
Correct.
Yeah.
How do we take that and say, what does this really
Sure.
mean? And I think that
Sure.
helps to give people
And that's the
confidence in what-
concept. That's the real concept.
Yes, and
Legalistic.
I think that before we could, as a mayor and council, and I'll just speak for myself, I think before I could say, yes, I want to approve this, is that we'd have to understand what that really meant. And to Joe Longoria's point, okay, so if that meant that we would be accepting a concept where the streetscapes that are mentioned, or the connectivity, that is an absolute within the concept plan. Well, what would that cost be if that's a concept plan?
What would that be?
What would the cost of that
Of
be?
the cost of it.
Because if we were going to say conceptually, yeah, we buy into this, probably couldn't say that unless we knew that an estimation of the cost would be X. A couple things that even before we could approve a concept plan, at least from my perspective, that goes back to one of the core elements of this was transfer development rights. And I think when we have talked in the past about what would be a potential draw, what's one of the things that brings developers to the mix, what is it that brings other businesses, but also residential folks being able to say, you know what, I could buy into this. I could see this being a long-term vision that we could see kind of as a forever plan. I do think that the transfer development rights concept continues to be really critical. And I think that in order to get buy-in collectively, not just amongst the folks in this room, but the folks that are the taxpayers that we all represent, I do think that we still need to pursue transfer development rights, because I think that without even looking at numbers, we could all agree that what's proposed visually here has some densities that are different than what's currently on the street. And I think that what we had all set up to this point was that transfer development rights would be an important component. And I think if we went back in time, before the master plan for Crabapple the first time was put in place, had we done some transfer development rights then, we would have ended up perhaps in a better place than we are even today, because we would have transferred some density from other locations. It would have come to Crabapple, and it wouldn't have been a question mark. So I would hope that staff is still pursuing that. I mean, to me, that's one of those things that was critical earlier, and it sure seems to still be. So I just haven't heard that discussion tonight, and I would hope that we haven't walked away from transfer development rights, because it had always been that this concept plan was predicated on, if there was going to be additional density, it was predicated on the premise that there would be development transferred in from another location. And so I know what the CPAC committee has talked about, it's what the Planning Commission has talked about. So I would think that tonight it would be important to at least have that to say, okay, that's still part of the discussion. I think if it's not part of the discussion, we may have moved away from what we've communicated to citizens and other folks that are participating in those other stakeholder meetings. So I don't know, Lou, if you want to talk about transfer development rights and where that was relative to the first meetings.
The plan was generated independent of transfer development, with the idea that TODs exist as a tool out there for densifying certain areas and undensifying other areas. I think what's important for us to think about also on TODs is, are you all willing to incentivize TODs or not? And I can't answer that question for you. The successful ones, you have to. If you're serious about them, you have to, because they won't happen on their own.
Well, and I think that the math of those is one of the things that's important. And again, if we try to, for consistency purposes, right now the document that went to the DAC and went to the state for a comprehensive land use plan talks about transfer development rights. So I think if we're not going to talk about TDRs or TODs, that we're not keeping all of those things in concert. So we're not going to resolve TODs and how the math should work, but obviously the math needs to be something that works, that incents people and does what it was intended to do. So that to me is just one item. The other, it just comes back to making sure that we understand the concept and how does that translate into data.
I think the concept can be, if I worked with staff, I think the concept can be abstracted into 5 statements of, the concept is this, it's the road system, it is the interconnectivity between point A and point D for pedestrians, bicycles, and golf carts, that cost is incurred by the developer, the development, and is not incurred by the city. C, we can put square footages. We can put give you statistics on the amount of infill we see. You say it's too much, it's too little. That can be quantified. To me, those are the big ones in the concept plan. That and the idea that you will adopt an architectural code and site plan codes and standards and things to really implement this.
And,
Yeah.
I'm sorry, Joe.
No, go
I was
ahead.
just going to say, and with one of those other elements that you guys might articulate together, that's just, to me, I see that just kind of as some fundamental ideas without getting too far into the weeds, but understanding that we can't approve the weeds if we don't know what the weeds are. And weeds, we don't know what the flowers are, I'll use a better analogy. But one thing I didn't hear in those 4 or 5 points would be the green fingers as an example. I think that it is...
That's the pedestrian bicycle golf cart. That's part of the whole concept.
Right, so that connectivity. 'Cause
Yes.
again, I think that's one of those things that folks, of course, you look at it and say, how could you not love this? It's kind of like baseball and apple pie or
Yeah.
whatever sport you might love. But that unless that is truly implementable, I think that we've got a smart enough citizenry and that they say, well, gee, if you can't get that green space, all we're getting is more density without the green space. And because a lot of those green fingers are private lands that we don't own, it's tough to say, yeah, guys, we're looking at this concept plan and we feel confident that we can achieve this green space. And if you go back to the first master plan, obviously where green space was supposed to be part of that master plan. And unfortunately, some of that green space didn't come to fruition. I just think that we owe it to the long term for this community, that for Crabapple to be sustainable, one of the things that I think businesses want and citizens want is some dedicated green space as part of it. And so I just, when we talked about bicycle paths and connectivity, I just didn't hear the green finger piece of that.
That's part of it.
And so maybe
It's
we could
part
articulate
of the system.
Right.
I think there are 2 parts to that system. When you talk about the pedestrian golf cart system, there's the part that deals with just the community itself, and then part B is more optimistic that it can connect with the countryside. That one, it's probably harder to fund
Right.
and actually do.
And to me, that's just the
And
reality check when you look
I
at
agree.
those pictures. And I think we heard that from citizens.
I
too. They
agree.
said, love that green finger, but where's that going to come from?
Yeah, I agree.
Is
That
there-
one's if there's something pie in the sky, that's the pie in the sky part. But it's perhaps attainable.
I mean,
Joe, did you have a comment?
Yeah. I hate to think about this as a zero-sum game. The idea that 5 months ago, even though we were thinking about something like this, we hadn't really put any energy into putting pencil to paper and getting your mind working on this. And to think that the cost of a crabapple area such as this has to come from some other area in Milton, I don't think it's fair to the rest of Milton. So to the transfer development right issue, I think that we should be looking at this as additive to Milton and not limiting on Milton. Because if transfer development rights are a key component of making this work, what we're really saying is the Webb Road Highway 9 area, which may have a similar capability, sorry, you guys can't do that here because we've used up all of the density that we have over in Crabapple. So even though I think that it's worthwhile thinking about it at some point in time, I don't see it as being key to us adopting the program or us implementing the program. If we figure out at some point in time, you know what, that there is just so many limited resources that we have, and we've got them all focused over here in Crabapple, we're going to have to limit how we control development in other areas of Milton. I don't really see that as being critical to the success of this.
You know where I think we are right now, and I certainly like the concept of transfer development rights. I think it could be something, a tool we could really use. But in all reality, right now, I think we just want the best plan
Right.
for Crabapple.
Exactly.
Let's not let something else drive it. Let's get the best plan, and then as we work further along, the staff and the council, we can figure out ways to do that and incentivize it. But right now, I think we just need the best plan. Just clean slate. It's not based on this or that. What works best here? I'd kind of like to too. This is kind of an informal meeting. Maybe let any of the public or citizens volunteer, and I'll let you talk, and then let them, give us some of their ideas just as we've gone through here, and we can continue our discussion. So maybe Karen, you've got some input, and then maybe Adam, I think you might have wanted to speak, and anybody else that would like to, love to listen to your comments.
Well, the reality is we want Crabapple to be a destination point where people come, where families want to live, where people want to shop, they want to go eat. There's an awful lot of properties right now that are already zoned commercial that haven't built anything there because economically it hasn't worked. So if we start putting a whole lot more restrictions on what the transfer of development rights, which I actually love the concept of and may work in other areas, but put a lot of restrictions on what they have to build somewhere. I think we've got to have some design standards, but we got to a little bit of flexibility with those. We want to encourage businesses to come there, not do a whole lot that's going to discourage them from being part of this. And I think we got to be careful to get that balance right, that we're actually encouraging businesses to want to come to the area, to make it a viable area, rather than discouraging them.
And I think it all goes back to what I said a minute ago. We need to just make this the best plan that there is for right now, because that's what you're doing, Lou. And then we work as a council and our staff and property owners as a working process to make it happen after the fact. So, I think we're putting the cart before the horse too. Let's get something that we all feel comfortable in buying and then move forward in how to.
Because we want to make sure what comes there adds to the area, not distracts from it. But at the same time, we want stuff to come.
If I can just make a quick comment, and maybe I don't understand the point, Karen, that you're making about it being limiting. I don't think that TDRs, or maybe Joe, maybe it wasn't Karen's, it was Joe's point, TDRs shouldn't be perceived as limiting. In fact, it allows a more expansive and robust sort of approach to Crabapple if you've got an area that currently doesn't allow for certain amounts of commercial. So maybe I'm confused about TDRs, although I don't think I am, is that TDRs really is not intended to be limiting. It's meant to have, and this is some of what's come out of the CPAC committee and the planning commission and of course our staff, is that it's a way to incent folks to come to an area that right now they may not have that opportunity to come. It's simply a receiving area. We're going to have more density. You guys know this, or maybe you don't, but I think it would be important for us to also, maybe at a separate meeting, to make sure that we have a level understanding, or at least we're perceiving them as the same thing, because I don't view TDRs as limiting at all.
Well,
it's actually a way
I think
to
overall,
incent
they're
businesses.
a great tool for the city of Milton.
Yeah, I do too.
Especially with, because we're different, obviously, and we've got a lot more residential and open land. So. But going back to maybe, Adam, would you like to make some comments? I know you had previously said, and if anybody else, just then we'll continue on, but I'd like to get your input.
Can I stand?
You can stand, sit, whatever you want to do.
All right. I think overall, we're all starting to get on track here. But if you look at the two keys that the private citizens, property owners need to have with the public sector, is we need to have trust, and we need to have flexibility. If you have trust and flexibility, everything will come together. If you go and look at the towns and the cities that trust and flexibility work with, that I think have great architectural bones, Charleston, South Carolina, Savannah, Georgia, the downtown area of Naples, 5th Avenue, 3rd Street, coastal communities of 30A down in Florida, coastal communities of California, Nantucket. Good relationships and a lot of flexibility with the property owners to design an element and uses that work. So if you step forward in time, we've gotten so many restrictions put on the property owners that when I go out to build something, heck, it looks like a drugstore because y'all dictate it needs to look like a drugstore. It looks like a fast food because the municipalities that we play under the rule book dictate it needs to look like that. But what is so great in Crabapple can be the same thing that you have in these other communities, and that is the architecture drives the uses. So if you allow the architecture to drive the uses, what difference does it matter what I put in my building? If I have a building that fronts on a main street and the architecture says it needs to have clapboard siding, it needs to be brick, it needs to look like this, it needs to be 2 stories. If the city eliminates all the uses you don't want tattoo parlors, you don't want topless bars. What else do you not want? Lawyers'
Fortune
offices.
tellers.
But, you know, what uses? So you take those uses and you put them over in a box and say, okay, you can't put these uses in the Crabapple area. Outside of that, I've got a building that's going to cost me $200, $300 a square foot to build. You got to be crazy if I'm not going to achieve my maximum rentals in that building. Give me the flexibility. If the market drives retail on the first floor, residential on the second floor, let me have those. If the market drives office upstairs, commercial on the first floor, the market will dictate what we can use our buildings for. The architecture is in place to protect the community as a whole. The streetscapes are in place to protect the community as a whole. These buildings are very expensive, but the market will drive the uses of the properties. That is just critical. When you get to the greenway trails and all the green space, it all comes together, but there's got to be money behind it. Either the property owners, I think if we were allowed to build and have the uses that would be appropriate for the area, I think we all could form some type of property owners guild, a CID, a TAD, something that would start to create a sum of money on the top that we would put right back into the infrastructure that was designed by the city planners. If you want an architect, well, that we could have a city architect down there, but once again, it would be part of that fee. And just like the CID that I sit on in the perimeter market, it's a different density, but at the end of the day, it's the same thing. Streetscapes come out of there, the road systems, a lot of the road systems come out of our CID money, the interchange you see on 400 comes out of our CID money. It's a bigger scale, but take that same thought process and put it here. So the more flexibility that the city allows the property owners to have, the property owners will build something that will look tremendous. It will look great. But if we don't have that flexibility, we'll continue to have this discussion, and poor Bill won't be here the day it finally passes. I don't want that to happen.
Well, the
So-
businesses will have a better chance of surviving,
They
and
will. The market always drives this stuff. When we get involved and we start to control the market, look what's happening up in Washington on a national level. We're trying to control everything. Let the controls off. That is what the American foundation, that's what this country is founded on, is let the entrepreneurs allow the market to control what happens, and it will work. It will work, but the key is flexibility and trust amongst both sides, and it will definitely work. I can answer specific questions if y'all have specific questions.
And Perimeter Center is looking like a new place.
It does.
It's
We've
amazing.
got great mixes of use because the
Amazing.
market dictates that. The infrastructure looks great.
I do have one question of Adam. I know that we've actually lost some businesses that had looked at coming to Milton because of problems with getting things approved with the design review board and things like that. Are you in favor of having a design review board oversee that architecture, or a paid architect or planner or whatever that really oversees it, so you have one professional person to do it?
My personal opinion is look at the towns that are most successful. Go to Kentlands up outside of in Gaithersburg, outside of Washington, D.C. They had a town architect. Looks phenomenal.
You can't ever get there with a committee.
Yeah,
You don't
have a
ever
town
get there.
architect. That's a professional. Think about what that person is. That's a person who's a professional. They went to school, they've studied this, they've practiced this, and it works perfect. If my arm's hurting, I'm not going to my attorney. I'm going to go to my doctor who specializes in arms. So let's get one person.
Well, and our design review board spends an incredible amount of volunteer time working on stuff, but
You don't ever get there with DRBs. It would be like trying to conduct a symphony with a committee. That's how awkward it is.
Yeah, you just have to have the right town architect. I mean,
You have to have the right
I mean,
one.
it's like a doctor.
Understands the
Hopefully, it wouldn't go
history
to
of
any
crab
doctor for your arm surgery, right? You want to go to the best you can get.
apple. On today's
Yeah.
market.
Yes.
Go to anybody. No, but you're right, Julie. I mean, it's got to be a town architect that understands the history and the architecture of the area in which they're practicing.
We could take our vision and
Right.
move
Yeah.
forward from there.
Yeah.
Anybody else? Doc, do you have any?
I don't really have any. I was trying just to kind of think about the complications of limiting use. And what you just said kind of changes that whole thing and let the market drive use versus I was trying to think, well, how in the heck would you ever build a building and say, well, it's got to be a drugstore or blah, 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 and then wait for those people to come in. You know, the other thing that I would probably interject with, if it's based on the successful model, which is based on getting buildings built and rented or used so to pay for those buildings, it would seem like there has to be other incentives as well. And when you were talking about the TDRs having incentives, you know, where you get, you know, plus density for doing the TDRs and all. I think there are always today in this economy, in this market, there has to be incentives for those that develop. And when Crabapple's plan first happened, you know, the developers were building streets. There was never any question about it. They got the intense density to build the streets. The problem was the rezoning ran out before we covered all the area that needed roads, and then a lot of the density that was given never developed, so the roads were never built. So we ended up with what we have.
Empty buckets.
Empty buckets, right. Which I always thought was a great analogy that Bill St. Aubin made. Take one bucket, fill the water, jam one hole in it, it drips. You know, you jam a bunch of them in there, and it leaks pretty fluidly. We only punched 3 holes instead of the 10 holes. So I would think that somewhere in this, the city has to incentivize business. And you were starting to say where it said, you know, people were coming here and didn't come here. Well, you know, I talked to a lot of businesses out there that just continually gripe about the city of Milton and how it's unfriendly from business and how there's no incentives. It's hard to open up a business here, and there's signage issues and problems and everything else. So I would think that, again, this is where I think you have to kind of go where no man's gone before, is you have to really incentivize everybody in this in this field to play, especially inside this economy. So, you know, if Adam's going to build the remaining 3 buildings or Ron and Adam will build the remaining 3 buildings on their property, there has to be some kind of incentive to do that, to make sure that you either can move with the market, or there's tax incentives to the businesses to come in there, or there's some type of other fluid movement that would allow things to happen. Because I think part of the quagmire in Crabapple now is we have too much space that's not leased, we have too much land that's not developed, there's not enough demand to fill it. And if we had a more positive plan of filling that, then, you know, I think that we could build the buildings and we could go ahead and carry on and go forward and make Crabapple, you know, very valuable.
Well, we're not at that critical mass that is the destination point. People now, when they come to Crabapple, they come for a specific
Well,
place.
you know, times are different. You know, years ago, the government developed infrastructure and whatnot, and then charged taxes and fees and whatnot. But you know, times are different. We depend, it's like a public-private partnership. We depend on a developer to put infrastructures in there and all. So it's got to be a win-win. And if you go back to, I think, Bert's point, and then I said, we need, as a city, to control the look, or, you know, specific. But we also need, to Adam's point, we need to have the flexibility that the private owners can do what they need to do to make it work, you know, so it's a win-win. And, you know, I think that's my biggest concern. I love the plan as it is, and I'd love to live there, you know, and be in a perfect world. And I can see withdrawal. But for the city's sake, and if we had more land like that, we could do that, that'd be great. But Milton's different. We've got, you know, what, 14% of our land only is designated commercial. The rest of it's residential. And so if we don't allow the property owners to go either residential or commercial or office or whatever the market dictates, we're kind of doing ourselves as a city a disservice, because, you know, if we load it all up to too much residential, then what about all the other residential? Does that make any sense, Lou? It's like, and again, I'm not sitting here saying it needs to be X number % residential or X number, but it needs to be whatever the market drives with some guidelines to make it successful.
Joe, can I add something to that too? Because it's the old statement of which comes first. You know, is you know, what's before what happens when. And the thing that I hear, and again, still trying to be an entrepreneur at heart, which I really am, is you have to think that if we've all identified there's something of richness and value here in Crabapple. And if we haven't, then I think maybe that goes ahead of a conceptual plan, is that do we truly have a location here in Milton that we want to see prosper and to see grow? You know, and it's kind of like everything else, is I decide to move to an area and I'm going to build a house and I'm going to live there and raise my family. You know, and I'm not talking about Milton or Crab Apple, I'm talking about me personally. So if the city of Milton looks at it the same way and says, well, I want to move somewhere and I want to raise a community, and I have determined that Crab Apple is going to be this place, this part of the 17% commercial, and we're going to do it there. We're going to move the government there. We're going to encourage the library to come there. We're going to build houses there for people to live and work, and there's going to be shopping, and there's going to be destination and things like that. Then it's like everything else. We're getting ready to make an investment in this thing. So again, getting back to which came first, well, you know, somehow, and you know, does the city, and again, in a day, let's say we don't have any financial limitations just for a minute, you know, maybe the city needs to go in there and build every one of these dang roads, put all the roads in there, develop the land, designate it, form base it, draw the architecture, and say, okay, here's our little town, here's all the roads, now build around it. So we've just kind of solved some of the traffic problems. Bill's lived through it. He sees a little bit of it happen. We got it on the ground. Developers want to come in and do it. Now you're building, you're taxing, you're growing, you have something of value, you've invested something in the city, and we finally put a stake in the ground and we start growing instead of all this scattered kind of management that this city's been doing for the last 6 years. We manage a little Crab Apple, we manage a little Highway 9, we manage a little cell tower, it's just kind of the way it was in the Fulton County days. We're firefighting, you know, we're reacting, we're not proactive in what we do.
You're right.
So I would say is that, well, if we've designated this, let's put our money and our hearts and our time and our effort where it lies. And that's kind of what I was saying earlier with my, you know, with my opening statement is, you know, it's time to do something. You know, because we can sit here and talk about this all day long and not make any decisions. And if Crab Apple ain't right, folks, then let's go build it next door here. Or let's go build it somewhere else. But, you know, let's make it happen. Because otherwise, I just see 6 more years, and I see 6 more years, I see 6 more years, and we're just sitting around waiting for something to happen, and it never happens. So, you know, my thing is let's get it done.
Bill and I'll both be gone by then.
That's my point. You clarified it for me, I guess. I buy into all of the guidelines and codes, and see the intrinsic value of this whole thing, and I see the virtues of developing like this. But I guess pointed to a developer out there, I understand there's various forms of financing. The CIDs will come after the fact, and you'll be able to fund other things down the road. But how do you kickstart this thing? How would you kickstart this thing and get it off the ground?
Well, because we don't have one developer. It's hard to have one person to be the master developer. But, you know, if the coffers were rich enough in Milton, you know, you simply do a formula, a mathematical study, financial study of the marketplace. And if the study dictates that the tax revenues flowing off of the properties, once they're redeveloped, support putting in the infrastructure and support the parts of the city that you guys want to see the tax base support, then the answer is the city should be the master developer, and y'all put in the infrastructure and allow the developers or the property owners to build out their properties. But if the formula says it doesn't work that way, then you're just going to have to kind of piecemeal it as you go. But there are a couple of key components that Lou put together that to me are very critical in order to slow down traffic going through the heart and route traffic around that circulator road system is, to me, very critical on getting that thing in place. And once you start to do that, you'll start to create more of a pedestrian atmosphere. So at least I would say, let's figure out a way to build that.
Well, the southwest corner, is really the only one that was developed according to the initial plan, behind the Alpharetta Government Building. And that's really the corner that you've really not showing hardly any changes at all to, because it's got all the infrastructure in there, none of which was paid for by Fulton County, believe me. It was all paid for by private development, because in order for them to get what they wanted, they had to give back, and that was to put in the infrastructure as it had been designated on the plan. And they were willing to put in all those roads because they got their house was, you know, their land was worth a lot more because they were able to put in the houses and all that made the plan work. So I think we've got to look at some of that too. I know Bruce Harris has spoken at the end of Charlotte Drive that he told me a while back may have changed now, but he would be willing to put in, the road through on his part of the property if it made sense economically, for him to do it. And so we got to look at some of that and see what we can do.
That's key. That's one of the first steps.
Speaking of first steps, and I may need a little professional help here too, to kind of, keep us on track, because, obviously, there's tons of work to be done, and as we go forward and all that, it kind of goes back to, what's our first step that the council needs to do that we would be comfortable with, limiting or not limiting, but to make this a successful venture. Because I think that's it's going to be a long process. There's going to have a lot of steps in between, and we can't vote on something or adopt something that's going to be an end-all right now, or even in the next, it's going to take a lot more time. And I also want to say I want to thank Lou. Lou's here kind of pro bono tonight, so, I don't want to keep you here too long and all that, so I want to try to, get a direction that we need to, and I don't know if Lynn, Chris, Ken, if you guys have any input on that, or Lou, if you have some suggestions moving forward, what we would need to do.
I'll start and just tell you what we've already done.
Sure.
Since transportation seems to be something that's talked about quite a bit, this plan has already made it to our transportation engineers. And what we've asked them to do is a couple of different things. One is to look at the network of it. And number two is to take some of these new routes here that are indicated, some of the larger routes, to take those and based on actual daily trips, do some prioritization for us to say, gosh, if y'all had money to do priority 1 and priority 2, that's 1, that's 2. I don't know what they are, but so that's already at our traffic engineers with Kimberly Horn, who did both the regional as well as our Milton CTP. So that's ongoing. What's also going to come out of that is potential costs for improvement. So we will have to be able to look at some of those things. So, we didn't wait much time, Lou. I hate to say it, but the day after you left, we started to try to get at least the infrastructure stuff, at least some questions answered. It's not back yet, but that will go a long way towards giving us a snapshot of what, if we desire to do what, Adam's talking about, or whatever which y'all decide to do, if the notion is that we'll put in some of this infrastructure to let the growth happen around it. We'll have better answers to those questions sooner rather than later. So I say I'll just give that as an update to say that's been ongoing now for about 3 weeks. So we should have those results soon, based on real world data. So, and we've shared your plan with GDOT, just to see conceptually what they thought, because we would go to, because this and this are state highways. The notion of putting a roundabout on the state highway, we wanted to see what the eyebrows did when they looked at the plan and said, whether we got that or we can live with that.
Well, and maybe they'd be willing to fund part of it if they are now funding roundabouts 100%.
I think cities are actually now required to do roundabout studies. If I'm
Look at.
yeah. So hopefully they'll like it.
But
We just
again,
didn't know what they would think about, because technically then, what you're generating here is your new state highway potentially is this.
Yeah.
You're trying to keep, so, anyway, we wanted to get them involved early on. I guess.
Sure.
It's a roundabout for free.
Yeah.
So those two things have already happened, and now I can,
From the planning end of it, obviously our comp plan, we've got to have the comp plan approved. So once we have that approved, it does talk about TDRs. It does have focus areas to look at for receiving areas. So that concept is still out there. It's not gone anywhere. It's just a matter of we've got to have an approved plan before we can act on any of that. The concept plan itself, you're going to have to approve, because that lays our foundation. That gives us our baseline. And once we get our baseline, then we can start pulling out. These are the key elements. These are the areas where we can start drawing transect zones, which are new zoning, and would require rezoning. But they're new zones that they're kind of upside down planner zones, is what I call them, because they're so general about use, but they're very specific about the architectural code. Once we get, like I said, our baselines laid out, then we can say, okay, whether it's Lou or whether it's, another urbanist, come write our architectural code for the area. We'll write that, and then the staff can do the transects in concert with each other so that they're working together. And we can have the architectural code and the transect zones then adopted at pretty close to the same time.
And how would all
Those would be
this
our
work?
next step, kind of the immediate steps.
How would this all work with the current Crabapple master plan and current overlays, and how do you coordinate all of that so that those are, updated or gone away or whatever you do to make them work? Would you replace the current Crabapple master plan with this new plan, or would you?
I think we would try to keep the pieces of that Crabapple master plan that still work.
Okay.
But there would be a whole lot of revamping, so that because the current Crabapple master plan is based on a lot of, it has a lot of specificity on use. And so we do want to kind of pull away from that if we want to go with the transect and the form-based type codes. So we would pull away from that.
But it does have some architectural guidelines and all that in there.
It does. And we try to keep like I said, the best of the best out of those and enhance them within each transect zone.
That's the kind of focus I think I'd like to see in our business. We deal with the schedules. I'd like to see an action plan like you just described and start expanding that. Let's get a step-by-step process as we move forward through this whole venture here. Lay it out in front of everybody so we can see where we are and how we're going to measure it as we move forward.
How can we be
funding?
We'll put that on your little fancy software you got. Lynn is the
The other 36
master. Lynn is the
projects.
master scheduler. There's pretty pictures about it too.
I like that.
How can we
Primavera.
be productive not only tonight but in the immediate future with Lou and Lou's plan? Because you look at even the agenda you put up. If we were trying to make all those decisions, right now, it'd take us a year or two. How can we be productive at this point? On a plan, can we? If the council wants to approve, basically this plan and concept as far as some architectural and maybe some layout, but not limit us in with, certain uses and all that, kind of like we were talking before, have a look, but, because, and Adam's correct, residential may not be the ticket that drives it right now, commercial may not be, it's going to have to be a mix or whatever, so, how can we move forward but not handicap both ourselves and the owners of the property?
Well, land use plans and master plans are a tool. So, as much as we want to try to adhere to them as closely as possible, they are still a tool and are subject to change. So, if we adopt this as a concept plan, that doesn't marry us to every jot and tittle of this plan. So, I think that first and foremost, that's got to happen. I think you've got to adopt it. Again, like I said, you don't have to agree with every single tree, every spacing of every sidewalk, but you've got to adopt the concept. And I think we can move from there.
And that being said, I'll ask the council too, are we at a point where we'd be comfortable adopting a concept, or do we need to, is there anything we need to work on a little bit more, or to get the ball rolling?
Well, I think to follow on what Chris said earlier, first of all, to make this happen, we don't have to adopt anything. We just have to do the things that need to be done, okay? So adoption, in my mind, is secondary to actually making something happen. But I think that Chris and the staff deserve a little bit of time to pull together the financial figures that we're going to need to review, the reality of these pieces and how they impact the different parts of the city and how we manage those parts. So I think it would be much easier for the council to adopt something if we really, had a better definition of what it all means to us.
I would agree. And I think that it's one thing to say, because I think conceptually, everybody wants to help Crabapple be sustainable. We want to make it sustainable for businesses. We want to make it sustainable for the residences that plan to be here, hopefully for the very long term, living, to be 150. And I think that part of that, though, does mean that we still need detail. And detail is not a bad thing. You know, detail's a good thing, because when we have details, everybody can buy into something, understanding how we're actually going to get from point A to point Z. And Joe, I think to your point, there's a lot of work that can be underway, that's already underway to Chris's point, without having to officially say we adopt the plan, in particular because the plan at this point is still very visual. So I would hope that in addition to the transportation figures, that Lynn, as you and Chris had already committed, that staff would be working to, maybe with Lou, maybe this is to your point, Joe, helping Lou define some of those things within the concept plan, such as those senior housing area, those pods. Because I do think that we need at least some additional detail to better understand what that is proposing. I think, Lou, your point about the 5 or 6 tenants that say a conceptual plan would include A, B, C, D, and F, but that it differentiates between a concept plan and things that we may not yet be ready to commit to. But it says at a minimum, yeah, we want to get transportation networks in place. We do want to investigate the cost of acquiring green space with a public-private partnership or a civic organization. But it just seems to me, Joe, I think you hit the nail on the head when you said there can be a lot of work that's continuing that addresses Buck's point of let's move without having to approve something that we yet don't really have the details of.
Lynn?
You can do that, yes. We can go through it and get to that level of detail with the concept plan.
I mean, any detail, I mean, at this point would be
Or
helpful.
we could do it with the transect zones themselves. So, I mean, I don't think that it's going to, and Lou, you can correct me if I'm wrong, I don't see that it's going to harm or, interfere with the integrity of the concept plan for us to do it at the time we start to approve these transect zones. Because that's where you're going to get that kind of finer grain detail as far as, again, the overall package.
And to me,
And
there's
the box of uses that you would rattle around with it.
And I'm not saying I want so much granularity of detail, I'm just saying at a very high level, as an example, how much land, the Crabapple master plan was 522 acres. How much land does this incorporate? The master plan of Crabapple had these areas that were residential, this was commercial. What is that proposing? I don't think that's such a level of detail that's unrealistic to have before we can say, yeah, I buy into the concept. Because right now, I don't think any of us could articulate well which of those pods are similar to the master plan today or are more expansive than.
And I'm not concerned about how much the old plan had in it. I'm concerned about what do we do going forward that's right. Because I really don't care what it had in it before. I want to know what do we need to make it be right in the future. And if we're on the wrong direction, let's change direction.
Let me just add something, and I know we're not going to answer all these questions tonight, but the one concern I have is, in fact, in talking to citizens that own property that were here tonight, they're ready to move forward on things, and they're going to move forward on things. And the longer we take without taking any kind of action, we may at some point, well, wait a minute, everything's already built out. If you look at their landowners now that have bought property in there recently and that are building structures and neighborhoods in there, that I hate to say would fit into your presentation on the pictures of the not the
Don't
ones
do
we want.
on some of it.
And, in the next 6 months, there's going to be a whole lot less of crabapple that we're going to have any control over if we don't at least have some kind of concept that we could get some buy-in, even if it's not, an ordinance yet or whatever. At least, when they come to us, hey, this is the direction we're going, would you mind kind of trying to work this fight?
Yeah, I mean, I saw the same thing going on.
So that's my
regretfully.
Yeah.
The way it is right now, I think we're going to
And it'll continue to happen.
I mean, the only reason it
with
has
just the dense neighborhoods there that aren't.
the only reason it hasn't happened
Well,
yet is because the economy was so bad that nobody was building anything. So I mean, we kind of had a 3 or
what's
4
happened,
year.
It's a very desirable area,
Yeah.
but in turn, you're putting,
Well,
less expensive structures in.
you can start your code,
Yeah.
you realize, independent of anything.
Right, you could start the architectural code without.
There's no
doing
question.
anything.
So how, is there? And again, we all have to realize, Lou performed the task that we hired him to do. So if we move forward, then obviously we're going to have to go back and relook at that with professionals and whether Lou wants to do that or not. What can we leave with tonight that kind of a direction that we think is the right direction to at least go in. Does anybody have any input on that? I'll tell you what my thoughts are, and then you guys can tell me if I'm crazy or not. You know, I like the looks and some of the architecture and things of the plan. But my concern is just trying to specify uses in the plan. So, you know, I'd like to leave here feeling like, okay, hey, we're all kind of on board with some concepts and whatnot, and we like this, but we also know it can be tweaked. And we also know, as I think even Adam said, you know, as long as we've got guidelines, you know, if you take your building that looks the way we want it to look, or in general, whether you put office in it, or an ice cream shop, or, you know, something like that, or a loft, you know, residential or whatever, we have, you know, flexibility to work that way.
Well, and there are very few parts of this that are that specific that we couldn't all agree on tonight, I think. And I mean, I think if we got rid of
What's the big picture we can all
yeah,
agree
the
on?
big picture we agree on. I mean, it says the mid-Broadwell retire in place concept. Well, if it just said the retire in place concept, we'd probably all agree on that. It just, and we may not all agree right now that it belongs on mid-Broadwell. So
Yeah.
if we could just get rid of the little bit of the specificity of it, then we can. It truly is a concept plan, and I think we ought to.
It's a
go with it.
concept that, use the retirement home, for example.
Right.
It's a concept that Lou's identified there's a need for it, but based on the way it develops out project, maybe it's going to go here, maybe it's going to go over here. You've shown maybe the best place for it, but that may not work out.
That's very flexible.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Adam, I think you had a comment.
To address that point, maybe what might be the easiest way to handle that is just instead of calling things certain names, let the architect work with the scale of its relationship to the street, its relationship to existing neighborhoods. And I'm sure Lou and Lynn can come up with the proper scaling of the building in question, and then let the landowner use it.
Maybe Ken could do it since you're thinking about going to your lawyer for your arm. Sure,
So send me a bill in the mail.
And I think that's the only thing that anyone has. You know, a lot of people have problems with is the fact that when things are very specific.
It's too specific.
Well,
Yeah.
could I-
Well, you can
Could I be safe
de-specify
to say
it.
this, that maybe if Lou can spend a little bit of time with our staff and work that out, however, and maybe generalize it a little more, but still have the concept, and then ask, or I'm asking now, is the council okay with that? You know, would the council be willing to take that one step forward if there was a little less specificity, you know, with certain
That's a
uses?
tough word
you
to
know?
say.
Yeah, I'm not
Specificity.
looking-
Specificity.
Well, and I
yes.
think that's what I said before. I think we need to get our arms around the entire issue here. Let's lay out a step-by-step process. I don't want to be sitting here 2 years from now talking about whether or not we need a porch on the old folks' home down the road here. Let's outline the whole doggone thing so we can attack it sensibly, keeping in mind that it can't take forever. Developers are not going to wait around forever for our answers, for our direction. But let's figure out how we're going to attack this thing in a timely manner. And I think Lynn's in tune with that, how to attack it.
And you can take out some of the specificity.
Specificity.
And then it truly is a concept plan that we can hopefully all just get approved, so that way we can start getting specifics.
Well, we have a concept that we like, and then, you know, work as pieces. And to, you know, Julie's point about TDRs and everything else we're talking about, we can try to work those in, you know, really, which those need to be worked in all over Milton, not just specifically
Right.
to this plan.
I mean, you really are going to need TDRs on Highway 9.
Oh yeah,
And greatly
and probably
incentivize
Arnold Mill too. So
Well, and just to lever off the points about concept, and I wrote down the term just global concepts. I think that if we want to move forward with the concept, we do need to generalize it. I do think that we still need, and that's the third time I said it, so I know I'm being redundant, but I want to make sure we capture. I think that there are also some details, I don't mean granular detail, we need some level of detail, as an example, something as general as, how much land does this potentially incorporate? Credible master plan was 522 acres, and so I think rather than to simply say, well, gee, we're just going to approve, well, what is it? Is it 1,000 acres? Is it 550 acres? Especially when we start talking about free-form, density, is that, are we saying that we're going to have free-form density across 700 acres of crabapple? That's very different than saying we're working within a concept of transportation networks, looking at free-form, but we don't know where it would be. Again, it's global concepts, but I think that there are still some of the data that needed to come out that was a fallout of what we had already talked about after the first meeting. So I don't think that any of that has gone away.
Your transect zones are going to specify where the free-form content of the building goes, like in a T5 and T6, which is the most intense usage. Those are actually the most flexible.
I mean, as an example, I know that out of that last meeting, when you talked about, as an example, an average of 2 to 3 units per acre. However, if we're really looking at a senior housing sort of thing, that's really not the density.
No.
And so and it doesn't mean it's good, bad, or indifferent. It's just that I think that those are going to be questions that I already know people have, and we may as well go ahead and address it and say that conceptually we're not agreeing to that now. So I think it's part of saying conceptually what do we agree to, and then conceptually what other things are going to need more work. But that way, to Karen's point, it makes it clear what are some of those global ideas that we all agree with. We need a transportation network, we need some cost associated with it. We all agree on architectural codes. And I think, to Bill's point, that also then starts to speak to project management and what are the steps within that. And there's some things that have to occur before we could approve a concept. It sounds like we don't have to wait for those. Some of that stuff's already underway to Chris's point. But I just don't think that tonight we could say, sure, we agree with the concept, to approve it.
Right. Step forward. Maybe tonight, if we determine what success is tonight, maybe it is the fact that we recognize that we might need to, I'm going to say it, we're going to take some specificity, out of the plan, and get it to something that I think hopefully y'all can come together and live with. I mean, we've got professionals on staff. What I'd ask you to let us do is let us run with this. I mean, and let us step out there and go with it. Now, I want to make sure that your heads are going this way when I say we're ready to step out and go with this. Because I don't want to come back and y'all go, what in the world are you step out there and go with this for?
I reserve the right to do that anyway. I'm shaking my head up and down.
But there's going to be check-in points, obviously, as we start to try to put this schedule together. If all of a sudden we bring forward something to you and you say, whoa, that was wrong, we'll course correct. But otherwise, I'm trying to sense how important this is to you all, and I'm sensing that at least to the group it's important that we're ready to step out there and go.
You guys speak up.
I agree.
I
I agree.
with that.
I just think step out and go
Alan?
doesn't mean that we're saying we agree to.
Step out to get us more information to
Yeah,
agree with.
absolutely.
To not let this thing sit on my shelf and collect dust.
Absolutely.
No
All right.
dust.
And
Y'all hear me?
Lou, we appreciate your
He's there.
time
He is
tonight. And, if Lou needs to be involved, we'll have to address that, as we move forward. But
And I think it would be important probably to go ahead and say, okay, we know that as Lynn, as you're looking at that, what components do you need to have Lou involved with so it doesn't become a halting thing?
sure.
Hey, you guys, I'm sorry, I was on mute, and I do agree as well.
Okay,
thank
good.
you.
I meant to ask how you're doing, Alan. Make sure you're still there.
You're a very good listener.
Somebody muted you, huh?
Okay. All right. Well, and also,
We're about to be good friends again.
yeah.
You missed me for a month, didn't you?
Well, it's been a good process. I've heard a lot of positive comments from, tell you, one of the most rewarding, I'll tell you real quick, one of the most rewarding stories I have about this whole process is I had a neighbor, and I'm not going to mention names, but just at the first meeting was just against everything, and she elected to come meet with Lou, and which I was surprised, and then I have a note on my desk saying, what a great concept, what a great, how great Lou was, how well, he knew his stuff, and was really excited about it now. So, I think that's pretty good. So we appreciate everything you've done,
My pleasure.
and look
Thank
forward
you.
to moving forward, now hopefully staff has kind of heard what in the council, and I think we're all on the same page about move forward with getting us some more information, so then we can kind of say, as Chris said, yay or nay, or we're going the right direction or we're not. So
Yeah, I
at least
really
because my
appreciate you
concern
coming
is,
tonight, because I think
you know,
it
My
was,
pleasure.
I tell you what, I guarantee if we have to wait 6 months before we've got something, you know, a third of crab apples is going to already change.
Yeah,
And it's not
momentum
gonna
is
be-
very important.
And I think too, Mayor, to your point, is that it may be that the order of how this stuff happens, depending on what Lynn and Lou and Chris's perspective is, you know, maybe because of what you're seeing coming through the door, if architectural code is what needs some attention sooner than other, it doesn't mean that the other stops, it just means maybe that's the priority because of the things that are about to come through the door.
They all inform each other too, all these realms. They're all inform each
Because
other.
that, to me, based on what you're saying, sounds like
Yeah,
the
now,
biggest
you know,
risk
at
at
least
the moment.
you guys know what we're looking at talking about now, so as people do come in, you know, kind of try to work with it. Okay.
Great, thank you.
thank
very
you.
much.
Thank you
Thank
very
you.
much.
Now.
Be safe, Alan.
Yeah,
Alan, I hope there's a basement wherever you are.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.